This frozen frontier is quickly becoming the hottest battleground on Earth, where power, territory, and global dominance are all on the line. And now, the US just made a move that could blow everything up. A move so bold, even Putin couldn't stay silent. You've heard whispers about it, but here's what's really happening. This isn't just about icy trade routes or melting glaciers. This is about Greenland, and how the fight over it could trigger a war no one's ready for. Let's break it down. Now, Greenland is no small prize. It's the world's largest island, more than 3 times the size of Texas. That's 836,330 square miles of immense geopolitical value, stretching over 1,660 miles from north to south and more than 650 miles from east to west at its widest point. It's an expanse of ice, tundra, and glaciers that dwarfs anything most countries can even dream of controlling. But the sheer size of Greenland isn't what's most impressive about it, it's where the land is located. You see, 2/3 of the island lies within the Arctic Circle, with the northern tip extending within 500 miles of the North Pole. That means Greenland is sitting right on the front lines of the Arctic's rich resources and strategic significance. And trust us, neither rich resources nor strategic significance does justice to what's really at play here. Beneath that vast sheet of ice lies a treasure trove of untapped wealth. As global warming continues to melt the Arctic, previously inaccessible resources are becoming more reachable. The region holds an estimated 90 billion barrels of oil, along with 1,669 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. And don't forget about natural gas liquids, around 44 billion barrels still waiting to be discovered. A large chunk of these resources sits offshore, adding even more value to this frozen land. But the stakes go beyond resources. The Arctic is also crucial for security, trade, and global influence. Simply put, whoever controls the Arctic controls the future, and Greenland is right at the heart of it all. Now, Greenland is officially part of the Kingdom of Denmark, one of the 2 autonomous territories alongside the Faroe Islands. Autonomous means that Greenland handles most of its internal affairs, but Denmark still holds the reins in defense and foreign policy. In return, the country provides around $670 million annually to support Greenland's economy. Historically, Greenland has always been tied to Europe, first with Norse settlers and later with Denmark. However, geographically, the island is part of North America. It's even physically connected to the continent through a submarine ridge no deeper than 600 feet. Canada is just 16 miles away across the Nares Strait, making Greenland a crucial link between the Arctic and the North American mainland. But while Canada has its Arctic ambitions, they don't include Greenland. It's the other of the 2 North American giants, the US, that sees Greenland as a pivotal piece in its quest for global power. But why? Why does the US want Greenland so desperately it's willing to acquire it one way or another, as Trump put it? Well, truth be told, there are so many reasons that it's almost hard to keep track. Here's why the US can't take its eyes off the Arctic gem. First up is the Pitufik Space Base. This base is the northernmost installation of the US Armed Forces, located 750 miles north of the Arctic Circle and 947 miles from the North Pole. It's one of only 2 Arctic facilities the US uses for its satellite and space defense operations. Losing access to this base would leave the US scrambling for alternatives and could significantly hurt its military space capabilities. But this isn't the only military reason for wanting Greenland. Greenland's location is vital for monitoring the Geoc Gap, Greenland-Iceland-UK, a critical maritime choke point. The gap is the gateway for potential enemy vessels trying to reach the eastern US and launch a strike. During the Cold War, the US was obsessed with closing this off, and now with Russia back in the Arctic game, that need has only grown stronger. So controlling Greenland means locking down access to the strategic gap and preventing unwanted visitors. Controlling Greenland also means accessing a literal gold mine under those glaciers. Greenland sits on an estimated 17.5 million barrels of oil and 148 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. Oh, and the best part? As the ice melts, thanks climate change, more of these resources are becoming accessible. The US could be looking at an energy windfall if it gets its hands on this treasure trove. And this treasure trove holds more than gas and oil, it also includes rare earth minerals. And if you want to make smartphones, electric cars, or military-grade technology, you need rare earth minerals. According to estimates, Greenland is sitting on some of the most coveted deposits in the world, including titanium and uranium. These minerals are vital for high-tech industries, and the US currently relies on China for many of them. Greenland could break that dependency and help America become more self-sufficient in the 21st century tech race. However, even if the US continues doing business with China, Greenland can still play a major role by significantly shortening shipping routes between the two countries. With global warming opening up Arctic shipping lanes, Greenland is right in the middle of new, faster routes for shipping goods between Asia, Europe, and North America. For example, the Northwest Passage now shaves 4,300 miles off shipping routes compared to the Panama Canal. This makes it a game-changing shortcut, but acquiring Greenland would change the game in more than one way. It would make the US the second largest country in the world by landmass, behind only Russia. It would be a historic territorial expansion that would put America's flag squarely in the heart of the Arctic. What's more, the US would secure its role in a rapidly shifting geopolitical landscape, where every nation from Russia to China is vying for influence in the Arctic. For these reasons alone, it's probably clear why the US is so adamant about acquiring Greenland, by any means necessary. However, considering how often one other country keeps popping up in these Arctic discussions, you can probably guess who's keeping an eye on the situation too: Russia. That's right, the US plans for Greenland have certainly not gone unnoticed by Moscow. In fact, Putin addressed them directly in a recent speech. The speech in question took place at the 6th International Arctic Forum held in Murmansk, Russia, on March 27, 2025. The forum, a major event focusing on Arctic affairs, brought together politicians, scientists, and business leaders to discuss the region's future. The theme of the forum this year was to live in the North. Well, if Putin's remarks at the forum are any indication, living in the North could soon get a lot more complicated. You see, Putin made it clear he takes the US plans for Greenland seriously, as should the rest of the world. He calls these plans rooted in history, and then he gave a brief history lesson, mentioning two separate instances when the US wanted to purchase Greenland. And for once, Putin wasn't wrong. The US did try to acquire Greenland on multiple occasions. One of the earliest came in 1867, right after the purchase of Alaska. Secretary of State William Seward suggested to Denmark the idea of acquiring both Greenland and Iceland, and the Danish side was open to the idea. The US even proposed a $5.5 million purchase, but domestic political turmoil and lack of support in Congress prevented the deal from moving forward. This was one of two attempts Putin mentioned in his speech. The next notable attempt came in 1910. A new offer emerged when Maurice Egan, US ambassador to Denmark, discussed swapping the southern islands of the Philippines for Greenland in negotiations with Danish officials. This plan was fueled by concern about Germany's increasing influence and the strategic importance of Greenland, but Denmark ultimately rejected the offer, preferring to keep its colonial interests intact. The most famous attempt, singled out by Putin as well, came right after World War II. In 1946, President Harry Truman put forth a bold offer: $100 million in gold plus a share of Alaskan oil for Greenland. The US had already established a military presence in Greenland during the war and recognized its vital location for Arctic defense, but Denmark, having navigated the war with no financial incentive to sell, turned down the offer that would today equate to over $1 billion. Still, this wasn't the last time the idea surfaced in the 20th century. In the mid-1950s, as the Cold War heated up, the US again internally discussed the idea of purchasing Greenland. Though its strategic importance remained high, the discussions never advanced to a formal offer, and Denmark's stance was never directly tested. Fast forward to the 21st century, and Trump expressed interest in Greenland during both of his presidential terms. His fascination with Greenland kicked off early in his first presidency. As far back as 2017, he tasked John Bolton, his national security advisor at the time, with exploring the possibility of buying the island. He even considered using federal funds for Puerto Rico to fund the deal. By 2019, his intentions were public, and Greenlandic and Danish leaders shot it down swiftly, with Denmark's prime minister calling the idea absurd. Trump then cancelled a planned state visit to Denmark, but he wasn't done. In his second term, Trump's interest ramped up. He expressed his desire to take control of Greenland for its strategic and economic value, including its mineral resources. To push Denmark, he floated ideas like imposing high tariffs on Danish goods and even suggested military action. But despite all his efforts, Greenland and Denmark stood their ground, reiterating that the island was not for sale. Trump's tactics may have become much more aggressive, but they didn't change the fact that Greenland remained firmly under Danish control. However, judging by his other actions so far, it seems that Trump gets whatever he wants, which could mean that he might actually succeed in something like this. But where does this leave Russia? Well, historically, the Kremlin hasn't been too thrilled about the idea of the US acquiring Greenland. In fact, it opposed the idea some 3 months ago. On January 13, 2025, Valentina Matvienko, the chairwoman of the Russian Federation Council, said, "We cannot help but be concerned about such as yet unclear approaches," adding that the Arctic should be a territory of peace and harmony. She warned that actions like Trump's could violate international law, stating, "We cannot rule out the possibility of violating international law in advancing to the Arctic." Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov also made it clear that Russia is monitoring the situation closely, although he added, "Thankfully for now it remains at the level of statements." However, by April of 2025, we've blown way past that level, so it's only natural for Russia's rhetoric to also get more aggressive, right? Well, not quite. In his March 2025 speech, Putin seemed to give a surprising green light to Trump, saying, "As for Greenland, this is a question that concerns two specific countries and has nothing to do with Russia." This comment appeared to signal a passive acceptance of the situation, implying that Russia wasn't overly concerned with US interests in Greenland, even if it wasn't officially endorsing the move. Now that's quite the 180, right? So much so that it makes you wonder why. Why is Putin suddenly fine with the US making unilateral moves in the Arctic? Well, that might have something to do with Ukraine. Putin's statement is likely part of a larger, more strategic play. By downplaying the significance of Greenland, Putin might be signaling that he's willing to overlook Trump's ambitions in exchange for a key favor elsewhere, namely in Ukraine. Putin, ever the tactician, might be betting that turning a blind eye to Greenland could buy him Trump's support in negotiating a peace deal or achieving Russian objectives in the region. After all, it's not unheard of for global leaders to swap concessions behind closed doors. However, even with his surprising flexibility on Greenland, Putin couldn't resist throwing in a few threats. After all, what's a Putin speech without them? Now, these threats weren't directed straight at the US, likely because of the underlying diplomatic calculus we just discussed, but as always, it's not hard to read between the lines. In his speech, Putin didn't come for the US. Instead, he called out NATO, and he didn't hold back. Putin warned that NATO countries were turning the far north into a springboard for possible conflicts, making it clear that Russia was carefully monitoring the situation. This was more than just a passing remark, it was a stern reminder that Russia is ready to defend its interests in the Arctic. "We will respond to all this," Putin said, leaving little doubt that Russia isn't about to stand idly by while foreign powers encroach on what it considers its backyard. The real sting came when Putin zeroed in on NATO's expansion, particularly the recent accession of Finland and Sweden. He called their membership a mistake, a slap to Russian influence in the region. As he noted, "For some reason they are creating it with their own hands. Why? It's completely incomprehensible." Obviously, this is a thinly veiled accusation that NATO is stirring up conflict in the Arctic for no good reason, and Russia isn't going to let that slide. Putin also reminded the world of the Arctic's increasing significance, both for Russia and the global community. "The role and significance of the Arctic are growing," he said, highlighting Russia's own reliance on Arctic trade routes and its vast natural resources in the region. "The Arctic zone accounts for more than a quarter of the territory of the Russian Federation," he stated, underscoring just how integral this region is to Russia's geography and economy. With nearly 2.5 million Russian citizens living and working there, it's not just a remote wilderness, it's a bustling part of the nation. But beyond the people and the land, the economic stakes are enormous. According to Putin, the Arctic generates about 7% of Russia's GDP and 11% of its exports. That's not a small chunk of the national economy, it's a substantial pillar of Russia's financial health. This explains why Putin is equally adamant about protecting Russia's interests in the region as Trump is trying to seize Greenland. His point was clear. If NATO thinks it can just waltz in and claim a peace, it's in for a rude awakening. Russia is prepared to defend its turf with everything it has. And considering Russia's military presence in the Arctic, these are no empty threats. Russia has the most extensive military presence in the Arctic by a margin, and Putin made sure to remind everyone of this fact by labeling Russia the largest Arctic power. The country controls 53% of the Arctic coastline, and it's been systematically increasing its military footprint in the region for years. The current state of Russia's Arctic military infrastructure might be rooted in the Soviet era, but Putin has made clear that modernization and expansion are top priorities. Over the past decade, Russia has reinvested in old military bases, notably around the Murmansk region, and ramped up its northern fleet capabilities, which include new icebreakers, missile systems, and Arctic-specific vehicles. Additionally, Russia is bolstering its defense capabilities in key locations like Wrangel Island, Cape Schmidt, and Kotelny Island, all of which are located just across the Bering Strait from Alaska. So Russia trumps NATO in the Arctic, and it only plans to continue this military expansion by stationing more military personnel and modernizing its military infrastructure. These actions alone are a threat to other key players in the region. But this is a classic Putin move, emphasizing peace and stability while simultaneously preparing for any challenges to Russia's interests, or better yet, perceived challenges. By framing Russia's actions as purely defensive, he positions the country as a protector of its sovereignty, even as it expands its military footprint. Though his message was directed at NATO, it's obvious that it applies to any country with interests in the Arctic, including the US. And compared to the US, Russia's position in the Arctic is far stronger in terms of military infrastructure. While the US has military bases in Alaska, Greenland, and Iceland, the Russian presence is far more concentrated and advanced. And the US knows that. The US Department of Defense has noted that Russia's expanding military infrastructure could soon allow it to enforce excessive and illegal maritime claims along key routes like the Northern Sea Route. So despite the current, somewhat cordial atmosphere between Russia and the US, it's clear that tensions in the Arctic are inevitable. With both nations staking their claims and interests in the region, it's only a matter of time before their paths cross and the friendly facade begins to crack. With this in mind, let's discuss a hypothetical scenario considering the current situation. Imagine this. Russia gives the green light for the US to claim Greenland, while the US turns a blind eye to Russia's actions in Ukraine. Both Putin and Trump, emboldened by their perceived victories, feel invincible in their sphere of influence. So where do they take it next? For Putin, the logic is simple. With the US distracted and focused on securing its Arctic ambitions, Russia can continue its aggressive push in Eastern Europe, Poland perhaps as the next target. The West would be too preoccupied with the fallout of a NATO alliance strained by America's territorial expansion in the Arctic to defend against Russia's next move. Trump, similarly empowered, sees an opportunity to assert American power, with Greenland firmly under US control and the Arctic becoming a strategic launchpad. The possibility of Iceland next on the table is not far-fetched, as even Putin hinted at this. Of course, Iceland, a country lying 200 miles to the southeast of Greenland, is a NATO member, which could pull the alliance into a more direct conflict with the US. Should NATO be forced into action to defend Iceland, Russia could quietly build its dominance over more regions without any significant intervention. And so the traditional world order, a relic of post-World War II diplomacy, begins to unravel, leaving smaller nations in the wake of these power plays. Both Putin and Trump, fueled by a shared disdain for international norms and cooperation, seize the chance to redefine their global influence. But here's the thing, at some point, the two powers will run out of options. Despite any temporary agreements or displays of cooperation, the Arctic isn't large enough for both of them to share peacefully. There are simply too many competing interests at play: natural resources, trade routes, military advantage, and national pride. Eventually, the tension will boil over, and diplomacy will no longer suffice. Even if the imperial expansion part of our hypothetical scenario doesn't happen, the Arctic region is still primed for conflict. The US will want to assert control over Arctic trade routes and natural reserves, while Russia, already deeply entrenched, will not back down from defending what it sees as its sovereign territory and economic lifeline. In short, the US will not allow Russia to dominate the Arctic and vice versa. Each country's military infrastructure in the region has been growing rapidly, and with the increasing strategic importance of the Arctic, both sides will continue to escalate their presence, trying to outpace the other. The mutual distrust between them will only deepen as they race for dominance over a landmass that could be the key to future global influence. And just like